Okay, everybody, welcome to a joint hearing of House Ways and Means and House Education on Friday, January 31st, 2025. This is a presentation from the Agency of Education on proposals for the Education Transformation Funding. A little bit more detail for us. Many of us have sort of gotten an appetizer looking at some of the presentation yesterday, which I assume this is pretty much what we're going to hear today. Anyway, it's Friday afternoon. We'll dive right into it. Floor is yours if you'd introduce yourselves and proceed. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Zoe Saunders, Secretary of Education.
Jill Briggs-Campbell, Interim Deputy Secretary of Education, and we're joined by some familiar faces for you all, Amanda Brown and Justin Silverstein from APA Consulting.
Wave. Great. Well, thank you for having us. I wanted to just start by providing a brief update since we met with you last week. We have produced the report that we'll walk through today that explains in detail the funding formula that is being proposed. Today we'll walk through some more of the numbers, also talk about the methodology and some of the explicit policy choices were made in terms of developing this proposal. The funding reinforce is part of the broader comprehensive effort, and so we are looking at this from three policy levers, so funding being one, education quality being another, and governance being a third. And so it's important as we walk through the funding just to reinforce how these areas are interconnected, and we'll speak to that as we talk about the specific components of the funding around the assumptions built into this regarding scale and also regarding educational delivery. Since we met last, we have started to launch our policy sprint teams. So this is an opportunity to bring together subject matter experts across state agencies and also in the field to bring together additional considerations that are going to be important to really achieving the shared goal of expanding educational quality, equity, and sustainability of our public education system. We have organized these sprint teams by the key content areas that are embedded in this policy proposal. We are really pleased to receive participation from our field partners in this work, and also that this is an opportunity for them to raise their hand and say, have you considered this? Or this might be an unintended consequence, and so those are things that we're all putting to the table as broader considerations.
Secretary Saunders, I'm sorry to jump in, and this is not, I don't think explicitly the topic of the meeting we're having today, but I believe that last time we maybe all met, I think we were all there. I asked about the relationship between the sprint teams and the commission and these committees and how you see those fitting together, and since you brought them up again, I'm wondering if you can flesh that out for me a little bit.
And ultimately, I think that the commission will be having those conversations. The commission reconvenes as an entire body next Monday. So what we're looking at with the sprint teams are very more operational in nature and being able to put forward some of the policy decisions that are part of this proposal and raising those considerations. I think the commission is another forum where we can have those broader conversations to bring the discussion into the fore around what are the implications broadly. I think the difference is that these sprint teams are much more operational, right? So they're getting into looking at the data, looking at the detail and the weeds and the nitty-gritty of these specific components. And then I think there's a value in bringing that back to the commission and putting forward some of those considerations and how this proposal would address them. What to expect next week will be a report on governance. So within that, we'll be talking more about the proposal related to the 5 districts, the role of the school boards, the role of the school advisory councils, also thinking about a broader education ecosystem and the role of tuitioning as well. So that will be forthcoming next week. So I just wanted to kind of give a sense of the additional detail that will be available. So with that, we'll move into focusing specifically today on the funding formula. We, in addition to
Before you can I ask? Do you have a sense of how you want to manage questions? Do you want us to roll through the whole proposal? There's a lot of detail and a lot of information. Do you just
What do you think? go through the whole thing and then.
But make
go to
sure
questions.
we're really saving significant time for questions.
Yeah.
I think it's easier to hold questions when you can trust that there will be time for those.
There should be plenty.
There should be
We have
plenty.
of time.
Okay, great.
And also, we are also offering to come back next week as folks have had time to absorb a 20-page report and highlight questions.
And I think we already scheduled you for that,
I
so
think
thank
we're
you.
working on that with Annie right after this, yeah. She just popped her head up, the answer is yes.
Okay, all right, so with that, yeah, we absolutely have plenty of time for questions and discussion towards the end, so I will turn it over to Justin Silverstein to walk through the slides.
Good to see you all again. Just briefly, and we'll, so we can get to questions, move pretty quickly through these slides, but we're going to start with just situating the funding proposal within the comprehensive education transformation. We'll then get into the specific numbers, which we promised you last week on the base, the weights, and then how we're thinking about categoricals. I'll then turn it over to Amanda Brown to talk about what does that look like as far as funding estimates for the new 5 districts, and then a comparison to FY25 appropriations. I think we'll have a couple slides on this, but again, it's really important that what we're laying out is related to thinking about this new governance structure. So it's really focused on the 5, when we land at the 5 districts. We started this using the evidence-based model produced by Pikus and Auden. We then adjusted that for Vermont context and resources to really implement Vermont's explicit policy objectives. We created some weights from there for student need, school scale, and district sparsity. And then again, we'll talk about how we are thinking about categorical funding, which includes special education and transportation. We believe that this new funding system will be more transparent, understandable, and predictable, and really predictable for schools, districts, families, taxpayers, and the state. And that's going to ensure that there's a fair distribution of resources across the state and really focused on 2 students with the same level of need are receiving the same level of resource regardless of where they live. The plan has robust education at the forefront, and that really, especially when you're comparing it to some other state funding models across the country, it would have produced an overall spending reduction of about $184 million. It is assuming currently the current portfolio of schools within that new governance structure of the 5 districts. Next slide. Sorry, I tried to switch it myself. Briefly, we're going to dig a little bit more into each of these. In everything in green is the proposed foundation funding. So a base amount of 13.2, weights for economically disadvantaged, EL students, CTE students, triple E, and then adjustments for district sparsity and size. All of that would be the total foundation funding. So that's the base and weights combined. And then districts would still receive categoricals, including special ed, transportation, state-placed students, and some other uses. Go to the next slide. I'm going to say it again, but we'll go quickly. This is all related to the education transformation policy brief from January 22nd. So I keep saying like weeks ago from last week. It's focused on those 5 districts, and some of the goals of getting to the new governance structure is lower administrative overhead. So you're going to have less districts who are operating central offices, but also the goal is to have those districts be at a more efficient scale. That you can have improved staffing efficiencies, where you could share some staff across schools and districts and really focus on achieving those evidence-based class sizes. There is potential for reducing costs and purchasing and centralized services as you bring up scale. And then the goal, again, equity of opportunity and equity for districts in terms of student need, and then community property wealth. And we'll show some examples of that. Go to the next slide. Just a comparison on the left here are the current 52 SUs and SDs. On the right, the proposed 5 districts. Clearly, much bigger districts, a lot more students. And if we go to the next slide, we can put that into context. We'd have districts ranging from a little over 10,000 students in the Northeast region to over 34,000 in the Champlain Valley. The range of free reduced price lunch percentage ranging from 36% up to 55%. EL percentage still low overall, with by far the highest percentage in the Champlain Valley region. And then on the right, one of the things we want to talk about is when we think about kind of wealth per district when we often think about this in school finance terms. And I think this came up a little bit yesterday as you had some presentations from some other great school finance folks. We really look at the wealth per, we talk about assessed value here, wealth per grand list. So the net grand list per ADM is the differentials going from about 900,000 per student to about 2 million per student in the new 5 districts. That's a little over one district being about having twice as much wealth per pupil as the other. That's more like 10 or 11 when you look at all 52 SUSDs, right? So really getting some shrinking in the variation in wealth per pupil as you get the scale also. Go to the next slide. Okay, so policy recommendations. Want to start with the base cost. If you look at, so let me take a little step back. On page 4 of the report is a list of all of the different materials that we reviewed throughout this process to really land on the recommendations we're going to go through the next couple slides. That includes a lot of different studies. For the base cost, really what we were focused on using was the Picus Auden model. And then we took that EB model and we made those adjustments to fit the context and priorities of the state. There's a layout of actually, the exact resources we changed within the model to get to this base, again, starting on that page 5 and going for a couple pages. But some of the really key things we were looking at is increasing college and career opportunities, and that's really middle school through high school. So thinking about CTE opportunities and college and career readiness opportunities, middle school through high school, expanding electives and specials, especially at the middle school, providing additional student mental health resources. That's something we hear nationally and clearly something we heard through the listen and learn. Increasing teacher salaries in the model, and then also rolling in the funding for flexible pathways into the base. So as we go to the student needs, I'm going to try to get clarity, and I'll probably just make things more confusing. I've done a really good job of that. I think there's been this belief that we are targeting explicitly the weights that are currently in the tax capacity formula that's used in the state. And I think it's clear we've been using those and looking at those and trying to understand the relationship of what we're developing to those weights. We also know folks have really pushed back on that and that they are not foundation formula weights. We know that Dr. Colby talked about that yesterday. When we look at how we did our work, and the economically disadvantaged starts on page 9 and kind of the weights go through the next set of pages, we really have an underlying resource base for each of these weights. And the goal was to find the information that allowed us to have that. And so we talked about it a little bit, I think, last week when we were there. And again, people can agree or disagree if these are the numbers we should have been pulling to get there, but these are what we were using. For the economically disadvantaged weight, really taking a look at what was in the task force report. And again, the numbers off the top of my head, kind of the 10,600 on top of a base of about 10,300. Using that, also looking at what's going on nationally, we are estimating a weight of about 0.75. For English learners, we turned to the 2024 EL study that was done, took a look at the recommendations there, took a look at the resources and how you could apply those resources into the evidence-based model. There, we're estimating a weight of 1.5 for EL learners. And I just want to reflect on, and the apples to apples thing is always hard. We know that new information came out from AIR yesterday, and our weights look pretty similar. They're on a different base, so the total dollars generated, but you're starting to get some similarity in the kind of scale of weight. And even when you look under the hood, pretty similar amounts of additional funding per student at a dollar amount. CTE, you can't really think just about the additional weight. We are targeting based on kind of the median spending currently, not including federal funds for CTE programming at CTE centers, funding amount of $25,000 going to a new CTE BOCES who would be overseeing overseeing the current CTE centers, assuming they would all still stay in place. The 1.3 funding generates about $17,000 for the students of the 25,000. The CTE students would still be the students of record for their district. They would now be in the 5 districts. We would have a 8,000, when I wrote in lieu of payment here, really it's, I think, known more as on behalf payment that would go to the CTE center, with about 5,000, a little over 5,000 remaining at the sending district. What we understand as we've studied CTE is that there are incurred costs, such as, being the district who's doing the diploma, doing other guidance and support services. Also, any sort of alignment between special ed services needed. Then also some of the loss of economies of scale as you send students from your high school up to the CTE center and wanting to take that into account. So those are the dollars that are staying at the sending district. We look to fund preschool students at 1.0 ADM versus the current negative 0.54, and keeping triple E at negative 0.54. Clearly, the triple E needs additional research, and so we are keeping where it is. And we know that is, again, one of the places where we're very much related to the current tax capacity adjustment and not a kind of a foundation developed weight. On the next slide. Categorical funding, we'll talk a little bit more about special education and transportation categoricals. Clearly, they're going to be kept, and we want to talk about the additional funding needed. Other categoricals that we're maintaining include the state play students and the list you see here on the slide. What we're looking at eliminating is really around places where we think the dollars are now being funded in the foundation formula. And so that would include technical education funding, EL services, and small schools. For special ed, one of the things we took a look at is current kind of cost for special ed versus the federal and state funding. And we recognize that there's about $70 million as an estimate, I believe, in 24-25, that was being raised additionally through local budget decisions. And so we would include that in the categorical to ensure the special ed's fully funded. And transportation, similarly, currently covered at 50%. Local districts have to build that through their budget. And so we'd want it at the 100%. I think in every area, targeting being most effective and efficient over time, but keeping for the as we implement those costs in mind. Go to next slide. And so this slide, I think, is where we are still most aligned or closest to the current weights that are really related to the tax capacity weights, but I think in a different way between these two. And I will say, I think the school size adjustment is very cost-based. And it starts on page 13, went into the EB model, made adjustments for scale for the types of resource changes that we think you would need at the different school sizes. Those numbers happen to come up close to what's currently in the formula. So we did link to those, in part because there's a familiarity in the system to those numbers. The actual application is very different, a smooth curve, going from, I think, 50 students all the way down to 450 student schools, and then doing this for all schools, not just necessarily small schools. So very different application, cost-based, but they, I think they are definitely linked to the 2019 study numbers. District sparsity, I think Amanda usually says it best, but I'll try it. Like, this is where we didn't have the apple to compare to. We didn't have a lot of other data. We left that in here, and so it is just coming straight out of that work. Go to the next slide. And I think I get to kick it over to Amanda.
Thank you, Justin. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. I'm gonna share with you, what does this all mean when you think about applying it to the 5 districts and the CT BOCES that we've been talking about. So what you'll see on this slide first is the column of the 2-year average ADM, then your free and reduced price lunch, the weighted ADM. So if you take each of those districts, count of FRL students multiplied by that weight of 0.75, these are the additional weighted students that would be generated. English learners is the additional weighted students that's generated after applying that 1.5 weight to the EL students in those districts. CTE, the weighted student funding count, is all sitting at that CTE BOCES. And then triple E is one where, because we left what's in the current system, and again, that's a place where there was just a bit of absence of other information that would point us in a different direction, it's applied in the negative. So that's why you see actually a loss when you look at the triple E column, because they're counted in the ADM. So this would just be the reduction in count by having that factor that's really a reduction factor. Then sparsity, again, to Justin's point, this is using the weights that are in the current system and modeling the additional students that would generate, and then the school size adjustment. And I really want to highlight something here. So this is applying that formula to Justin's point. That's a smooth curve that provides additional funding for any school that has less than 450 students. So the vast majority of schools in Vermont are less than the 450 that's in the base, because that should be really your lowest point in a funding formula that you then adjust from to account for differences in scale, because you do have some settings that operate at that kind of larger size. So you don't want to overfund in those settings. So you set your base as your low point and adjust for scale from there. And so we generate about 5,000 students, so more students than are currently generated through your size adjustment. If we go to the next slide, oh, sorry, in some, we're generating about 122,000 weighted ADM students, so your long-term weighted ADM. Then looking at this next slide is what does that mean for dollars? And all these figures that you'll see here are in millions of dollars. So the first column being that base column, so generating about 1.1 billion or $1,100 million. Economically disadvantaged, generating another 360. English learners, 37. CTE, I want to highlight here that this is the weighting and process is generating an additional about 50 million of extra funding, but in total it's about 75 million that would be spent on CTE when you factor in those on behalf of payments that would be coming from the sending districts. Which is, of a scale that's currently being spent on CTE in the state based on current expenditures. The EEE funding, again, is a little different because it's applying in a negative. And again, that's a policy choice if you treat those students differently than your other preschool students or the same. Sparsity funding is about 60 million and about 64 million coming out of the school size adjustment. So then we compared this to those estimates, which are all in FY25 numbers, to FY25 appropriations. And just pausing here to say, this is not saying we're suggesting that this is what you would put in, we're in FY25, but trying to get a sense of scale of what you might expect in difference when the system is implemented down the line. So you can see the foundation formula that we saw on the preceding slide totals out to $1,668 or so million, which is less than the current education fund. But I do want to highlight a couple places where we are then higher than other appropriations currently. To Justin's point, we have increased the amount you see for special education, recognizing that right now local communities are funding above and beyond what state and federal sources provide. So we have an extra 70 million there. State place did not change. Transportation, similar to what Justin said earlier, you're reimbursing right now up to 50%. Without local budget decisions, you would want to make sure that that's fully funded. So we went with 100% there. Technical education is a zero here because, again, we are now providing that about 75 million for CTE in the foundation formula. Small schools, we've eliminated that 2 million here. That shows up in that 64 million or so on the preceding slide as part of the foundation formula. We kept the EEE aid, which is really the supplemental funding for EEE for special education services. We left that there. Flexible pathways has been built into the base. And you'll see in the report where we talk about where we built that in, it was about $110 a student that we added into the base to generate the similar level of funding that was previously provided in a categorical. English learner services, we've eliminated this 2 million this year, believing that it's fully accounted for. And I think it was about 37 million on the preceding slide for English learner services. And then we left the remainder as is related to the pension and the other costs and categories that are noted there. So we end up with the difference being $183 million difference. The one I forgot to mention is we also do not have universal school meals as part of the funding policy recommendation based on the governor's recommended budget. So that's where we are on that. And again, I think just reiterating Justin's point that the funding that we're putting here is really related to being part of that larger transformational change. So these numbers reflect that future governance model. I did have one more slide. Apologize. We also compared how would these new recommendations in a few key areas, the base and the weights, compare to other states. So what we found when we compare Vermont's proposed base and then the amount of funding that's generated through the weights recommended to other states, Vermont would have a base that's one of the highest bases in the country. I think there's only 2 other states, maybe DC and New Jersey, that would have a higher base amount than Vermont at that level. And the at-risk and EL weights would generate more funding that's generated in any other state formula. So we really believe it's a really robust and generous funding formula. Any questions? So I think we can probably turn off the slide so you can.
I love that we always end with questions, as if you don't have
I
1,000.
I think we'll just wrap here.
No, we're good.
No, right? Yeah, that did it. No, I'm sure there's plenty of questions.
Anything further before we go to questions? Okay.
Jill or Zoe, did you have anything to add?
I think we're ready for questions.
Okay, I think that there'll be several of them, and we'll kind of go ping pong back and forth among our committees. Then maybe the chairs will begin. I've got at least 5 here, but I'm only going to ask one, and that is the weight given to pre-K of a solid 1. How does that intermix with our system that's in many areas largely simply a voucher system with a value that is far less than a 1 count, let's just say?
So what that recommendation is based on what came out of the pre-K, the legislative committee focusing on the pre-K implementation. That group recommended to maintain the 3-year-old benefit at its current number of hours and expand for 4-year-olds. So this funding is intended to support that recommendation. Part of the pre-K implementation sprint team is thinking through some of those mechanics that you're addressing and making sure that the intent here is to fully or expand our funding for pre-K education and building that into the base. A question around operations is also important as we're thinking about additional funding that's available for pre-K as well. So part of this work is, we're talking about the specific funding formula within education. We know that as part of this approach, there's opportunity to do some graded funding as well. So we're coordinating really closely with CDD on understanding of the funding available to support the childcare setting, the funding also available to support within our public school settings.
I guess my question is more, right now the pre-K requirement is 10 hours a week, not a full-time student.
Right, the policy is not to make that required, it's to give the opportunity to have the full day and be able to fund it as such.
Representative Kornheiser?
I'm trying to figure out where the savings comes from, and I saw a lot of moving around of line items, and I'm also trying to understand. It's gonna be like a very long framed question. I'm really sorry. I'm also trying to understand if the numbers that you're giving us today are the numbers that would go out to support the current state, or if they're imagined to support a future state. And what I want to understand, I'm hoping to understand, maybe not this week, but at least by the end of next week, how we get from current state to future state, yes, if that's true, and how dollars work in that. But very specifically, it seems like, well, the Picus and Auden report estimated a number based on school and district sizes that we absolutely don't have. We have very much acknowledged that we don't have that, and Picus very much acknowledged that we don't have that, and it was never sort of intended to be modeling what we have or what we could get tomorrow. And you went up basically like $1,000 per student in order to model what sounds like the same number of schools with the same number of students in them in a similar arrangement. That's what I understand from your slide deck. And so I just can't fathom where the actual cost savings is coming from and how that $1,000 is somehow just covering the difference between our current state and this other thing. So, I mean, quite frankly, like, what is being cut?
So I think our current system, there's a lot of inefficiencies. There's also a lot of variability with how we are operating schools. So as part of the funding, we've modeled, what would be possible with this funding amount in terms of the staffing and resources available. There is flexibility within the districts to make adjustments. But the policy component of this would be also establishing some minimums in terms of class size, and things of that nature to bring us into scale. We are assuming that this work does take longer time to get to the optimum level. And so in the first modeling, it's assuming that we will be carrying some additional cost in the first year to maintain the current school portfolio, but there will need to be shifts in terms of operations and staffing to be able to deliver on the proposal.
So when you say the current modeling is
For fiscal year 28,
for fiscal year 28 is the numbers that we're looking at
yes.
right now. That's for fiscal year 28.
Yes,
And that changes will happen between now and fiscal year 28 to be able to achieve the savings you see here for fiscal year 28. What are those changes?
so.
What are the efficiencies that are gained between now and fiscal year 28 that would make this possible?
So I think overall, there's differences as we look at this modeling in terms of our staffing. There will definitely be changes regarding staffing as we look at the class size and the support infrastructure. So when you think about, there's a couple different areas. We've been, as a state, really trying to understand how we can appropriately resource every school and every district. This allows us to have some of those additional services and support within the larger central offices to be able to deliver on that, and reducing some of the administrative overhead we currently have within our current construct. Also with looking at some of the minimum class sizes, that would make some adjustments as well, and we'd see more continuity in terms of those ratios statewide.
So I'm sorry, I'm trying to get really, and I think part of it is I want to see a massive Gantt chart or something. I don't know,
right.
but
And I think where you're getting at is that we know that there are certain schools where this would be really challenging to achieve without considerable adjustments and changes. So part of the work that we're doing now is to identify where that's going to be really challenging, and there's going to need to be support and kind of accelerated planning in working with those schools and those districts to be able to move towards this. We also, and I've said this several times in committee, we know that there are many districts that are struggling operationally right now, and the agency's been very engaged in supporting with some of the stabilization efforts. So those are areas where it behooves us to really work closely in coordination with those districts and those schools to provide some of this support to getting to that optimum scale and making sure that they can have the resources and expertise. But I hear you in that the transitioning of this timeline is where I think a lot of the questions are coming. And some of the work that we'll be doing is getting really tactical around understanding what those changes would look like within the 2-year timeframe specific to, I think, schools and regions, which is what a lot of your questions are centered around.
This is the last. So can you give a sort of a specific example of, say, a school that would not be able to, whether because of their physical infrastructure or geographic isolation or political vibes, able to make the adjustments to match up with your modified PICUS model? What will happen between now and 2 years from now?
So there's an assumption in this model. I think we've assumed within this, it's about a $50 million or is kind of built into this model of assuming that there will be some maintenance of the existing portfolio. So I just want to kind of call that out, and on the page of the report, we've identified within these scale adjustments that there will be additional costs associated with maintaining that scale. So I think that's kind of baked in. In terms of understanding some of the transitions, that will be part of the work of identifying, to your point, those schools that are operating at an efficiency level, right? So not all schools are operating within the same infrastructure. We see some small schools that are operating at much greater efficiency than other schools. Part of this work is also supporting with strategic budgeting. The agency has been supporting with this work around really more precise budgeting to staffing based on current enrollment. There are situations where there may be a school that is not able to achieve some of what we're describing in terms of class size, for example, and those are conversations where then that would be the work happening at the local level to understand how might we make some of those adjustments with the area schools.
If you, page 13 is where we have that really detailed school scale and how the resource base was adjusted to that. So if folks have more specific questions about that, Amanda could certainly answer those. And I think Rep. Kornheiser, on like the most basic level, right? So this funding system contemplates that in FY28, we would be moving to 5 districts, but the same portfolio of schools, recognizing that it will take time to achieve the efficiencies. I would say this funding model also recognizes really explicitly that we're going to continue to have a lot of schools that are smaller than those contemplated in the Picus and Auden model, particularly the elementary schools, right? So I don't think that any of us in this room think that we're ever going to get to a situation where we're going to have all of our elementary schools have 400 students, right? That's just not the reality of the Vermont context. And if you sort of look at the way that we've adjusted sort of the scale and the weights on page 13, and again, if folks have specific questions, I think Amanda can answer these more eloquently than I can. We've contemplated what that might look like as well. But we also, I always want to like bring the complexity back in, because why not? This proposal is a 3-legged stool, right? So it's funding, and that's what we're talking about today. It's governance and scale, and it's education quality and accountability. And there are moves to on-ramp us towards this kind of future state around things like class size, which a lot of committees are already discussing. Class size minimums, this contemplates a class size, an average class size, right? That's built into the model. And it's explicitly called out in the report, so folks can look at what that is. I think it's, Amanda, check me, it's 15-to-1 for elementary through 3rd grade. And then,
Exactly.
I nailed it. And then larger class size above that, which is in line with kind of national standards and evidence-based practices. So
And it's 25-to-1.
thank you for saving me on that.
You're welcome.
And then so over the next 2 years, how do we move towards that scale so that we are preparing the system for what FY28 might look like? Those are policy proposals that are built into the governor's overall policy framework.
I also want to just call out something around methodology. So in approaching this work, we made a very strategic choice to focus on building this around education quality. Other states might have approached us looking at what is the available funding and how do we adjust that within our means. So when we're talking about cost savings, we weren't approaching this as saying, what is the universe of funding and how do we realign our current funding to achieve cuts? The approach was, how do we build this model to ensure that we can prioritize those educational costs that we know are going to be generating the best opportunities for our kids and equity. So I want to make that distinction because I know that there's a real focus on the cost savings. The approach to this was not about getting to a cost savings. The approach of this was, how do we prioritize how we fund education to ensure we can deliver on explicit and express policy objectives that Vermont has already established, and do that in a way that is going to be efficient and at scale so that we can be sustainable. I think your question is really pointing to the fact that in our current system, there's a lot of variability with how we're delivering education across districts. And so we didn't start from that variability. But to your point, now we need to understand where there are schools and districts that are at different places of implementation and being able to understand that delta in terms of the spending and the delivery to ensure that we can get into alignment here. And I think, again, it's important to reinforce that as we did this modeling, then we went back and we said, what is our existing infrastructure and where do we have schools that are not at this optimum scale? The formula here is making those adjustments that was applied to the model to assume the additional cost to keeping that school portfolio. But I think your question is really pointing to the challenging part as we look at this is that we know there is so much variability across our system. There's variability in spending, there's variability in terms of classes, there's variability in terms of cost for the same career and technical education program. So that is true within our system. What this is helping us to do is to be consistent and more standardized around those investments and ensuring that we have that equitable quality. Some of the savings that we are seeing is because we have a very inefficient system with a lot of considerable variability across the state. And as we do this work, it's really important, and I know that the agency, we're very focused on this, is how do we support with the transition, right? Because these, any sort of change to the education system can be very disruptive to teaching and learning. Some of this work is also moving us to best practices in education. There's been a lot of recent legislation to try to get us there in different areas, and we know that that programmatic support needs to come with these funding changes. So I think it's, again, reinforcing that this isn't just about funding, it's about really providing the support to achieve some of these best practices in teaching and learning and funding them appropriately and at the scale that we need to ensure that there is equity across the state.
Representative Brady, then Representative Maslin.
Are there any schools in our existing portfolio that are operating within the assumptions that are in all of this modeling that aren't either too small to be functional or going to face a lot of cuts? Because as I'm looking at actual spending on budgets that have been warned, I'm struggling to see how any school, including our largest schools that presumably are the sort of comprehensive high schools that we're talking about in a future state, would face tremendous cuts under this plan. So I need to understand what this real school is that you're envisioning, because I don't see it anywhere in our system right now.
Are you looking for, I guess, side-by-side comparison as your like current state to future state? Is that what you're?
Sure, I guess, are there no schools or systems at all operating near the assumptions as they exist? And that feels to me like much bigger than a 3-year transition if we're talking about change happening to happen everywhere.
And again, we're assuming that that change won't happen within 2 years. We are assuming that there will still be schools that are operating with fewer students than that optimum. We are making that assumption built in. But I do hear your question around practically speaking in terms of how the resources are allocated, in terms of what those impacts would be on programmatic.
Practically speaking, I'm looking at our largest districts all over the state. But we have several that are operating at scale or have high schools that are certainly well within all of the research from what we've heard here, what we've heard in testimony again and again of a model high school. And so if they are far outside of this model, I'm struggling to see what that transition is. Is it to close all of our schools? Is it to reduce services? I don't see how that increases electives or does these other sort of quality goals if we're saying the places that are closest to scale are not really even on the ballpark of where these estimates have us going.
So I think that what would be important in terms of the next step and what I'm hearing is getting really concrete so that you can really understand this within the context of like schools that you are familiar with and what that would look like in terms of the transition. We can certainly do that.
Representative Maslin.
Yes, thank you. And Representative Brady, you use different words from what I'm going to say, but it's all part of this discussion. I appreciate your saying that this is going to take a number of years. Much of the anxiety out there has to do with exactly that.
Yes.
And there are people that we're hearing from frequently with louder voices, wondering, if you'll pardon my language, how the hell is this going to work? Because if there's extreme anxiety in a number of small schools, even those we could call that we very small, but are functioning very well, on how we're going to get there from here. And I would just restate for your benefit, this anxiety out there is very profound, and it'll have much to do with how well we transition from here to there. And if it's not addressed, things will go sideways, and we'll all have hell to pay. But thank you.
I think, if I can also just comment, I think we also need to contemplate a little bit our current situation as well, right? So in no way dismissing that anxiety, and in no way dismissing the need to be as concrete as possible. Our current situation is that some of our highest needs districts serving our most disadvantaged students are today cutting critical education programs today in their FY26 budget, right? So we also have to hold that anxiety as well, right? And our intention throughout this has been laser focused on how we ensure that all students have the same opportunities. And we know we've demonstrated pretty clearly that that is not the case right now. And so I do think we have to also kind of hold that, and part of this aggressive timeline is, I think it's absolutely natural to say we need way more time to do this. But the sort of real consequences of that are the students who are currently in those systems that are losing out on those opportunities in real time. So I think that's also part of our urgency to move quickly as well.
McCann, Brannigan, Burkhart.
I'm
Jenny, then
wondering
you.
how your model reflects the ever increasing cost of healthcare.
I keep getting asked to fix the healthcare system. So, I think what this model is looking to, we're focused on education quality. I know healthcare definitely has a connection as we're thinking about the overall benefits for the teacher package. So that's obviously part of this. It's not expected that this plan, the education transformation, is also addressing and reforming our healthcare system. And I think what we do know is that this work intersects with a lot of other areas. And we heard that really clearly through our Listen and Learn tour, that a lot of the challenges that our schools are facing are reflective of the broader challenges in the community related to affordability, related to access to housing, related to access to healthcare. So, I think from the administration perspective, there's a commitment to looking at this work holistically and understanding that this isn't just about education, but this is around how do we really build vibrant communities, and thinking intentionally around how we do that coordination with the Agency of Human Services, with the Department of Labor, around this work, and making sure that we can address the broader needs.
Representative
Do you
Brannigan.
mind if I?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think at a kind of technical level, there is a benefit rate that is applied within the evidence-based model, and so that is something that could be adjusted based on that estimate of cost.
So, honestly, the work doesn't scare me. People in our district were amazingly flexible and hardworking and committed during the pandemic. They did wonderful work. And I don't know how to explain the children's test scores, but I know that our schools functioned and meals got delivered, and people were learning. The children were learning on Zoom, and it seemed to work. They were reading. So the work doesn't bother me. What bothers me is that I'm not convinced that in the end we'll have a more productive system. And that really bothers me. And I also want to remind everybody around the table that in a month, it's town meeting. And my two communities both still have a town meeting where people get together and talk about problems in the community, and this is going to be number one. What can I tell them?
What can you tell them about the
Yeah,
proposal?
about this, about how it will work, about what that $13,200 is going to be used for, and how did it end up that we are going to be bundled in with Burlington, and how will that all work? How many superintendents will we have? If it's only 3 years down the road, we gotta have some really firm places to head.
For sure. So next week in the governance report, we'll be providing more details around what this actually looks like in terms of operationalizing. What does that central office look like within this model? What does it look like in terms of the schools, in terms of staffing? What is the role of the school board? What's the role of the school advisory council? So hopefully that will help you to answer some of those questions. I think your specific question around kind of why we're bundled in, right? That's an interesting question. What we're talking about is really creating a shared sense of community. And for us to really focus on equity as a state, it's important for us to have a broader view of the needs of multiple towns. So that we can be intentional around really investing dollars in those areas that have higher needs. So having a broader view and a larger shared responsibility over multiple communities can help us to do that. But we also understand that at that local level, there are decisions made at the school, and we want to create those mechanisms and opportunities for even further engagement at that level. So the approach is really trying to achieve that balance between unity and freedom. So at that larger district level, there's kind of a shared responsibility for a larger group of communities. It also allows us to provide additional resources to support more schools in a way that right now many districts are not able to do because of budget cuts, while still allowing for that localized engagement at the school level.
Representative Burkhardt.
Add one more thing to that. When part of your question is, what does the 13,000 get us? What's put forward in the EB model is a way of coming up with what that amount is, but it's not intended to be prescriptive, and this is how you have to use the dollars. So I think to answer that part of the question, the money then goes to the district, who then makes those choices as a community on how best to use their dollars. So I just wanted to kind of name that there's still that local opportunity for engagement within this. So.
And if we can, I'll add one more thing. And part of the proposal also includes a requirement for an equity-based district budget model, right? So and there's a lot of precedent for this. Schools work with this with their title funds all the time. That in addition to that base, there are also the weights that are defined by student characteristic, and we want to ensure that those resources are allocated proportionate to sort of where you have your students with highest need. And so there will be that sort of equity model as well that is built into the proposal, so that we have our highest need schools also, having their proportionate share.
And in my district, the change will go from 2,700 children in all three towns to 34,000.
Understood.
That scares me. How will we have a voice?
I'm going to say we'll
I'm
hold
not
that for the
convinced.
governance discussion,
Please.
and we'll try to keep it to the funding at the moment. Representative Burkhardt.
Yeah, I'm sorry to bring it back to the discussion about where the cost savings are. It would be really helpful for my brain to have a map that says, here are the buckets and here's where the savings are coming from. This is what's coming from fewer administrators being in the state. This is what's coming from cutting core teachers because we're combining classrooms to an optimal size, and all of those different buckets. This is what's coming from taking away universal school meals out of the budget. All of these different things that are actually where the cost savings are coming from would be helpful for me to see laid out on paper so I could understand them better. My question, though, aside from the data request, is you talk about raising teacher salaries. How is that going to work across the state when we have some teachers at one end and some teachers at another end? Who is negotiating those salaries and those collective bargaining agreements? How is that portion of the cost structure going to work?
So one thing I want to reinforce just your first question, because your first question is where is the cost savings coming from? We did not approach this work to get to cost savings. I think that's really important to emphasize. We approached this work around how do we develop education quality and strengthen our public education system by prioritizing this funding. With that, we have greater efficiency and there are cost savings. I understand that people want to understand exactly what that looks like and where, and so we can certainly follow up, but I do think it's really important to emphasize that this approach was not about cutting and reducing. It was about how do we design our public education system in a way that's going to allow us to offer greater educational opportunities in a way that's more equitable and sustainable. And because we have a lot of inefficiencies and a lot of variability in our system, that also translates into cost savings. But I do hear the question from many of you to get concrete around what that looks like and then how we support that transition. And that is important to make sure that the field gets the support that it needs, because at the end of the day, no matter where we are in 5 years, we have students that we're responsible for educating now, and we have teachers that are doing a great job of that and they need to be supported. So I hear the question and I commit to making sure we can follow up on that in practical terms around what that looks like, again, over a 2-year period. With the question regarding teacher salaries, we have heard that. We see that there is disparity in terms of teacher salaries. In the analysis that we've done, we've identified that our smaller supervisory unions tend to serve higher needs students. They tend to pay their teachers less. And so we see that as a real equity challenge for our state. The explicit goal of this is to really promote teacher pay equity in our community, so that a teacher that's working in a higher needs community that may be more rural area can have a competitive salary just as if they were working in a bigger town. And so that's the policy intent. There are multiple pathways to get there. We've started having those conversations with the Vermont NEA, and we'll bring in some resources from how other states can establish that. The explicit goals are really what's important here. Equally important are the mechanisms to get there. So we'll be bringing forward some considerations around what that would look like in practice, and making sure that we're thoughtful around that and it's done in a way that is fair. But in the actual model and the practicality of it, what's baked in to the base is an additional $5,000 on average for teacher salaries. How that's distributed will be related to creating that teacher pay equity across the state. It could come in the form of having a statewide salary schedule and things of that nature to ensure that we get to that equity.
A very patient Representative Wozniak.
First time that's ever been said. And forgive me because I'm not known for being subtle either. So I appreciate that your view is that this has been approached in the lens of educational equity. However, I would argue that we're almost certainly here because the governor has been arguing that we've been spending too much money on education for many years. And so while I appreciate you and our consultants approaching this from educational quality, that's not the message we've been getting from the governor over the past few years. And he's talked about consolidation as an effort to save money in cost of pure pupil spending. So in the student services, in taking care of the whole student like we've been talking about, the implementation of mental health supports. In the report on multiple pages, it talks about counselors/social workers/mental health professionals. Those are 3 very different jobs that provide 3 very different supports to students. And that is also not something that's currently built into our current educational funding model. So I'm curious as to how does that money go? If it's true that we're not going to prescribe how the districts are going to spend the money, how are we going to ensure that those services are being offered to our students while still maintaining cost savings? Because we don't have mental health counselors or social workers in every school. So if we're going to do that, that's going to cost more money than we're spending now.
When we're talking about these resources, I think it's hard to separate that from our existing state, right? So If everything stays the same in terms of how we operate, yes, that would be considered an additional cost. What this model is doing is saying, if we are able to fund at this level, this is the quality that we can provide, and these are some of the resources that are baked into this model. So it's not an overlay of our existing system. The reason that there are different positions noted there is that there is, and there should be, flexibility within the district around how you're prioritizing those dollars. So even within a district, you might have different resources assigned for different schools depending on their need. So that could also translate into a community schools coordinator in particular areas of our state where that's really important to coordinate services. So the intent is to build in that flexibility, recognizing that within your broader district, your schools and the communities within those might have different needs. So it is intended to be flexible. We had a lot of conversation as we were building the base around, should that be baked into the base or should that be as a grant categorical outside? And in other states, they've made different choices. We think, and I think this goes back to the broader healthcare conversation right now, we know that right now our schools are asked to provide those services, and we know that our healthcare system is under a lot of strain. So we made the decision to bake that into the base in time. As there's additional kind of reform and improvement efforts within the healthcare system, it might make sense for that to come out of the base, right? But the reason to bake that in was we know that that's such a big need. We heard that consistently coming out through our Listen and Learn tour, and it was important to us to make sure that we're baking that in so that that's a resource. To your point around how do you ensure that that's implemented effectively, I think that goes into what is the support that's available, what's the guidance available that the Agency of Education can help with, and also your broader regional office. So I think that goes into some of the questions around how we're defining educational quality. This is very much a whole child approach. And so what type of guidance can we bring in to ensure that those dollars are really being able to be leveraged in a way to support students?
And I guess that is, to be fair to you, a bit of a policy and governance question, so
Yes.
I'll be following that and my friends on the House Education Committee as they work out all of the policy of this. So then the next on supporting the whole student, has the administration, has the governor, has the agency considered the mental health impacts on the 27,000 students who are going to lose access to school meals because they are well above the threshold for qualifying on their income and well below the Vermont Basic Needs budget? What is the impact on mental health of the 27,000 kids who will not have access to school meals under this plan?
Yeah, so we're receiving a lot of questions around school meals. So as the governor had indicated in his budget proposal, he's suggesting to move towards a means-based system, so away from universal school meals to still ensuring that students in poverty can access free meals at school. We will be providing additional information around what those impacts will actually be school by school so that you have that information available, and we have received requests and are actively working on that. But he's definitely been very consistent in being focused on making sure that students in poverty still have access to free meals as part of the whole child.
And we don't have to model that. We just have to look at what was happening before 2019, because we're not talking about moving towards a means testing. We're talking about moving back to what we were doing before we were guaranteeing food for our children in schools. So then my last question, I promise, is has the agency then, there's a lot that goes into, as you know just as well as I do, the old model of school meals. So we're talking more paperwork, we are talking staff that have to do the cash registers, we're talking schools that now have to repurchase cash registers, retrain staff, repurchase POS and software systems. In your modeling for the funding, have you offered any financial supports to districts to have to, for all of the associated costs of transitioning back to a system that will fundamentally feed less children?
So I think there's opportunity to look at how we do this within the new model, right? And I would assume that there's some additional efficiencies that we can build in to make sure that that support is there to deliver the meals. We know that there's a lot of questions around this. We are committed to providing all the information that's necessary. We also understand that there's a lot of changes happening at the federal level. And so it's hard to know what drawdown will be available for a universal school meals program. So I think it's an opportunity for us to engage in the conversation in the context of the new models, the new districts, and also understanding what will be available for federal dollars.
if the federal government is withdrawing support for student services, I would argue that it's the state's responsibility to step up, not also retreat. And now I'm done.
Yeah,
I'm
so
gonna
I
move on
would
to-
say for this proposal, I mean, I think this is the need for transformation within our system is so that we can have stabilization as a state, right? I think that is also an explicit goal. There may be shifts in terms of federal decision-making that happens over time. And we want to make sure that as a state, we have a really excellent funding system that can promote equity. What we have seen is that many of our high-needs communities are depending on those federal dollars to be able to provide additional services and resources. That's not coming from our education fund, right? So your point is well taken, and that this conversation is really around making sure that as a state, we are developing a funding system and an overall model and approach for education that can deliver on Vermont's values and can resource our communities in a way that's equitable, irrespective of changes, right, with federal funding, to the degree we can manage that, and in future-proofing us to other economic changes. So that's kind of the sense of urgency of having these conversations, and I know we're all really passionate about that because we want to do what's best for our kids.
Representative Harple.
Can I just add, I want to add one other thing around the mental health and the base, and really sort of reminding again that this base as sort of described here would be one of the most generous in the country. But also there's the additional weights for economically disadvantaged students that could also be used to provide additional wraparound services, additional academic supports, right? So there is additional dollars not beyond just the base, which is a very generous base, that could then be decisions could be made by districts and local schools around how do they support the needs of their particular students through additional resources. So again, that might be the hiring of a community schools coordinator, which was an explicit goal that we had when we were actually looking at this base and weights, was how do we support our really successful community schools and get them off of the grant cycle, was an explicit goal that we had. And if you have a high needs community, those additional weights and the dollars that they produce, you could then use to drive kind of academic and wraparound supports for those students. So we want to be holistic as we're looking at the funding model that's proposed here.
Yes, Representative Harple.
Yes, sorry if I missed this or if everyone else except for me understands this. But looking at the charts so the tables on page 13, I see your proposed numbers based on students, and I'm just wondering where in all of that come in our bus drivers, our support staff, our custodians, our lunch staff. Are these decisions that you would be expecting schools to make, or are these decisions you're releasing later, or do you have any idea what those numbers would be?
Amanda can speak to this, I think.
Yeah, so,
We received this question from superintendents too, so.
no, so I'm gonna disentangle the question just a little bit. So there is an amount in there, you'll see in the chart that's describing district staff that's overseeing like maintenance and operations. There's also a dollar amount in the base. It's about 1,000. It's part of one of the considerations of the school scale adjustment that goes up from there. But that would be where you would think about your groundskeepers, your custodians, again, your maintenance and operations staff. To your part of questions on transportation, bus staff would be in that additional allocation for transportation. So that would be accounted for there. So you wouldn't see that in the base funding. And then food service is not explicitly addressed. Food service, and this is an assumption in school finance, tends to be looked at as self-sustaining between your sources of revenue, either from nutrition meals or fees that you're charging families. So again, we've heard conversation, should that be the approach, but that's how school finance is traditionally approached food service, is thinking about it separate from ongoing operation costs.
And paraeducators?
And so paraeducators, this model does not specifically have paras in the base. That would be, I would assume, part of the funding in special education, because we've modeled the special education funding to be consistent with current spending in special education, which does include paraprofessionals.
And folks, just to refer to this, it's table 3, starting at the bottom. So table 2 has the school level staffing, and then table 3 on page 6 of the report going on to page 7 identifies those additional FTEs at that district.
And the Picus and Auden report would have some more specifics backing up that maintenance and operations in terms of what does it mean on the number of custodians or groundskeeper staff. So there's more depth in that report to refer to that's not in this summary.
And I also, Amanda, you would want me to point out, there's the table and then there's the narrative under the table that is also important to read in the context of the table. So, yeah, as you have larger districts, you add more staff per student.
Representative Taylor, then Representative Holcomb.
I'm kind of going back and forth with myself on this question. This is even a question that can be answered. We're all looking at the base cost right now, and that's a totally different way that we all have at looking at this. So has there been any modeling done on kind of what the typical average student in a district would be, what the cost would be with the weights included, to give us a more accurate look, more accurate comparable to what we've got going on now?
Amanda, do you want to respond to that? And I will flip quickly through the report and try and find that.
No, that is not modeling that we've put out yet. So I think it's as Secretary Saunders was talking about, we can do some more practical comparison of what does current state to recommended state look like.
So, you're right, and I think the question that you have is like the per pupil. So a student that is in poverty, what is the amount of the funding with the base and with the weight?
With the weights
Yes,
added in.
yeah, that has been modeled.
That has been.
Yes, and what that would be if that student gets the base and lives in poverty and is an English learner, what would that be?
That's in this report, I missed it.
I thought it was.
Thank you for clarifying the question. I was
If I can, I think you would have to, you probably have to add the numbers together.
Yeah.
But just, and again, and we can get these to you, for a student who is both free reduced price lunch, or who is free reduced price lunch, the total funding would be $23,100. For a student who is English learner, total funding would be $33,000. I think there's still an underlying question about would you stack the weights? I think what came from Dr. Colby yesterday talked about every weight being stacked, so you get the full weight. If you did that, a free reduced price lunch, student who is also EL would receive $42,900.
Thank you.
And I think the overall spending is an important point. And I know we're talking about a very different system in terms of how it's designed. That's why we're referencing the prior reports. And when we talk about the overall spend, being able to show that comparability to what the research was indicating a student would need to be able to deliver a high quality education. So that's what we were talking about, is they're describing the comparisons to other research. It's not around how it was derived, it's more around what that gets you in terms of the overall spending per child. What this approach is different than our prior approach in that it's saying if you have these needs, the state would be guaranteeing you this amount, as opposed to your community having the ability to raise that with tax capacity.
And that reminder that this would still leave us as one of the top spenders on education in the nation.
Yeah, we would still be one of the top spenders. We would still have relatively small schools compared to other states across the country as well.
Representative Holcomb.
First of all, thank you for being here, and I'm so sorry, but I'm going to take you back about 20 minutes or 30 minutes in the conversation, because that's how we go with questions. And I really appreciate your taking the time here today. I was interested to hear you confirm that what this really outlines is a future state or based on a future reality, and we're not there yet. And I'm trying to balance that against the reality of where we are, which is the product of years of policy decisions. And unlike some districts and unlike some states, Vermont has made specific choices about what it uses its schools to do. So we are stuck in a higher cost, higher different world than the states, which is why actually I really don't care what other states do because their bases are actually not relevant to what we do here, so that's not a helpful conversation. We could choose to do things like other states, but we need, I guess I just wonder if you ever thought about a plan that would walk us or map out over years the steps we need to take to get from where we are. You know, when we look at this plan on page 19, it looks to me like we're looking or predicting $165 million in cuts or unneeded expenses that you're expecting to save. You know, how do we get there? I think this goes back to the question that we started with. Where are those cuts coming from? Because currently we're operating in a model and under a funding formula that was designed not to bring people down, not to level down, but to level up, to try to figure out how to make sure districts have the opportunities to generate the outcomes we have. And money does matter. I mean, it matters how you spend it. And I think we need to be careful to distinguish between distribution, is the money going to the right places, like Teddy's district, but I'm trying to understand how in the minute we take 165 million out of our systems and don't do some serious damage along the way. And I wondered what your plan was. How do we step from where we are into this imagined future that you're hoping we can achieve in a way that protects our children, given the reality of what we're expecting our schools to do across all those communities? And with that, I wondered if you considered two other things. One, there is a direct relationship between the support the agency has the capacity to offer and frankly, cost on the ground. When I came into Education Vermont, we were known nationally for the support that our Agency of Education provided around professional development and learning. And we didn't have to do that. We had graduate level courses on site in our elementary schools to do teaching of literacy that we didn't have to organize because the agency was ahead of the game in doing it. All that capacity has been cut out. We also had, you know, when you look at some of the issues around special ed, I noticed the 70 million seems to correspond to the 70 million in extraordinary expenses. That line item is out of control. It's growing faster than I've ever seen it grow. We've lost control of cost in special education. There is nothing they can do locally. In fact, they're not even incentivized to pay attention to that cost. If the agency cannot provide strong support and technical assistance around special education, there is no way this change does not harm real kids in real communities and real taxpayers in school districts. So I wondered if part of your plan was also looking at what capacity needs to be housed at the Agency of Education so we can pay attention to those day-to-day operations in ways that actually shield districts from out of control costs. Because right now there's some things that they just can't control. And then the last is I wondered, you've got great data that you've been using to model all of these costs, and I wondered if you could actually share that data with us so we can try to replicate this and also test what small changes might do to some of the costs and some of the assumptions in your model.
So one, I would say what drew me to Vermont is the amount of focus and emphasis on education and ensuring educational quality and really engaging communities in a very meaningful way. It is a core value in Vermont, and as someone who's new to the state, I think it inspires me every day, right? So I take that really seriously, and it's a source of pride for me, and I'm also a mom of kids in the system, and so it's also very personal, this work. And so I hear the intent of all of the policy decisions that have been made over the last several years. It's really designed to level up. It's really intended to be equitable. But what we're seeing in practice, that's not panning out, I think, as we've intended.
That's
right?
not my, I don't want to go down that rat hole because that's not what we're talking about.
Right. So but I think that's an important part, right? Like all of these decisions are made with all the right intent. And I think we're continuing to have that right intent of making sure that our students get what they need, that it's equitable. We recognize that schools are an important part of the community, that they're doing more than just educating students. That's why this whole child approach is really important to this work. But it is important to establish that distinction that while it's designed to do that, we're seeing that there's challenges for us to be able to implement that in practice. And so I think that's why we're all coming together to say, we know we need to make some changes to be able to deliver that equitable education in a way that we desire and that I think everyone is very committed to doing. Change is very hard, and I think it's important for us to be very concrete with what that will look like in time, and that's what we're hearing very consistently in the conversation today is really practical. What does this mean next year? What type of changes need to happen for us to get to this future state? The role of the Agency of Education is important to think about when you talk about overall capacity. When we're approaching this plan, we're talking about capacity of our entire statewide public education system. And we often talk about having the right expertise at the right level. And so that's getting the right expertise in the classroom, at the regional level, and yes, also at the Agency of Education. And then what are additional services that might be needed through a board of cooperative education, right? These are all of those structural and governance questions that I think are of paramount importance for us to be able to deliver on a plan that produces these intended outcomes. So we will be sharing our thinking around that next week, and we know that there'll be some further conversations to ensure that our entire system has the support that it needs at every level and to achieve these goals. So hopefully that, I'm not sure if I answered every part of
My
your
three
question.
questions were, are you going to provide a plan that steps us from this
Yes.
vision
Yes,
to
correct.
there from where we are?
Yeah.
Can you provide
Yes.
the data? And have you looked at what capacities need to be at
Yes.
the Agency of
So
Education?
all of those are,
And
yes.
the data has been shared with joint
Great,
fiscal
thank you.
office, so I think
Thanks.
maybe that's the right.
Perfect, thank
Okay.
you. I just
Yeah.
didn't know that.
And I think the other piece of this puzzle is that on the ground, superintendents and principals and school boards are trying to make some of these changes that I think are directionally in alignment with where we're headed. So it's important for us to be able to, oftentimes we say this a lot, at the local level, I say sometimes we don't have the cover to do that work, or we might not have the right parameters in place to be able to do that in a way that's planful and intentional. So part of mapping this out and getting concrete and answering all three of those questions is also being clear around where we're headed. And I think that will support some of this organic work too at the local level to get to this future state. I actually think there's a lot of alignment around the future state. And we're hearing that as we're engaging with stakeholders across the state is we know we have to do this big work. We know that there's a lot of excitement and opportunity in doing this big work. But we're also have some fears about this, right? And how do we do this well? How do we do this the right way? And I can just share that from the administration, we are really committed to doing this the right way, making sure that it's quality. And so we'll definitely continue to engage in these conversations. And I just hope that we continue to stay focused on that. And you know, we are very intentional about making the questions and considerations explicit. And if we don't have the full answers, to coming back and addressing those. So thank you for the questions, and I hope we continue that dialogue.
Anybody who hasn't had an opportunity to ask a question, I want to make sure we get everybody who has. Ooh,
I was just it's like a testimony question. It's time.
okay. We got a few minutes for maybe a second round. I might open it up and ask you to explain a little bit more about the CTE model.
Yep.
And also how it refers back to the base.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, frankly, the CTEs that I know on a per pupil spending basis are well above the base that we're talking about here. So just give me a little understanding of this BOCES model with CTE.
And can you pull
Also, I just
back
wanna
up
signal-
that slide
Yeah.
with the math about how part of it was going to go to one place? And
Yeah, and
I
this
felt like those
also,
words were
just to
confusing.
signal, this is like an additional round of testimony because there's a full proposal with this as
Okay.
well, so.
All right. Yeah, then if you can keep it fairly high level then.
Yes.
All right, let me see if I can. Go ahead, Justin.
Yeah, the estimated cost, looking at the current median spending for CTEs across Vermont, the centers, is $25,000. And so the goal would be to get that $25,000 per FTE to the new BOCES. To do that, recognizing that every student is still going to be kind of a student of record in their district. We understood, kind of the pot available was the base, some of the base, and then this additional weight. So the goal is to get to 25,000. 8,000 of that is coming from the base amount for that student that is going to the CTE as a really on behalf of payment. And the rest of that is this weight, which generates about 17,000. So the 17 plus the 8,000 gets to the 25,000. So far above the 13.2 funding base.
Okay, so that money. All
I need a
right.
graphic.
I might hold that
It's
there.
forthcoming.
On the same, I mean, in a way, it's a little bit of a tuitioning model, and I'll use that opportunity to move on to tuitioning. We do have a number of districts that have no control over their per pupil spending because they're paying a tuition to an independent school. If we have one of those districts and you've got a regular old 1.0 no weight added student, and you're conceivably receiving $13,000 for that student, how does that translate into a school that may be charging $19,000 a year?
So in this model, students are receiving the same base and weights.
Okay. So if you are a non-operating district and every one of your students does not get a weight of some kind, because we aren't doing grade level weights, it looks like, then you're receiving that base level weight or the base amount, and yet you could be dealing with a need to pay tuition that's far above that.
I think we're getting ahead of ourselves with the
Yeah,
governance. So this is the funding that would be consistent within the education ecosystem.
All right. So we will look forward to more detail when we talk about governance.
Yes. Yep.
Thank you. Representative Kimball?
Just one question. Yesterday we heard, I thought I'd stand up because now I can see.
Okay,
Hello. Yesterday we heard some interesting concepts about variable bases based on cost of living, and I know you said in the report you didn't offer a proposal this time. And then weighting depending upon the extremity of maybe somebody's English as a second language or other special needs students. Did you consider that in this model, and why did you, if you did and you didn't propose it, why not? Thinking about that.
Justin and Amanda, I don't know if you want to address that? Yeah.
Yeah, if you could take down the slides, it helps us, it helps me feel a little bit more like I'm in the room. There we go. We did, for this model, we did not look at that. And I would, we listened to the testimony yesterday, and I would suggest that we at APA, so I'll say an APA thing, not for AOE or anyone else, really believe in a single base. It could be in part because we come from a state in Colorado that had that multiple base for a long time. And one of the key things in its most recent change was to get rid of what we called the multiplicative approach. You can apply, because of PEMDAS, right, because of order of operations, if you want to apply something like cost of living or anything else, you can do it at the end and get the same net effect. But what that allows you to do is have a really clear understanding of what you're generating for each district for these individual weights. When you have differential weights, it gets really messy to figure out what part of the at-risk or their free to express lunch is cost of living or size related versus what we think is the additional real cost of a student. So we didn't, for that reason, we did consider, we did not go into looking at a cost of living adjustment, I'd say that, but we did consider the rest of the adjustments that would be on the table that might produce differential weights or differential bases.
Amanda, you were really eloquent about this earlier today because we were having this conversation. And Amanda, if you would kind of talk about that, the base and kind of the understanding of the theory of action around the base.
Yeah, so the theory of action around the base is that the base is really your lowest cost in the system. And that is the amount that you ensure is the floor of funding that every student would have access to. You then want to make adjustments for all those different pieces that we're talking about. The size of the school that a student attends, if they're an English learner, if they're an at-risk student, you want to go up from there. And to Justin's point, being very clear about where is the funding, what is it intended to target. I think, again, you could consider if you want to add a regional cost adjustment on top of that. So you could do it as a separate, to Justin's point, you keep the same base. You want that base to be the same amount for every student in your state that you then adjust from. So really the floor. So I'm not sure if I articulated it as well as Jill was hoping I would. I did want to say something about
coffee earlier. No. So there's different
because I'm more caffeinated.
I think there's different mechanisms, what they're saying to get to achieve that.
And then I would say just on I believe your other question was around the English learner weight and if we considered a tiered approach to English learners. For this modeling, we have used a single weight, but we very much think it's something the state could explore, doing a tiered weight instead of a single weight. the Colby study from 2024 and the information that was provided is really consistent with work that APA has done and recommended in other other states around having a tiered approach that differentiates funding for English learners based on their WIDA level. The recent work in Vermont was building off of work that we've done in Ohio and Nevada and other states. So we did not recommend it at this time, but do think it's a policy consideration that could be on the table.
Thank you.
Representative Kornheiser with a couple of final requests.
Yeah.
Understanding we will
We're all
have more
doing
time
this more next week.
Next week.
I have two questions to essentially help me prepare
We did agree
to make sure we have to make sure that we're prepared to ask the right questions next week and that we have the right people scheduled for next week.
Okay.
So one is that I had mistakenly assumed that your budget presentation was going to be part of this block of testimony, which I think was a miscommunication, but which we don't need to resolve right now. We don't need to resolve right now, but it's the question about it is, are there one-time or multi-year costs that will be needed in the system for the children to reach the efficiencies that you're modeling?
Okay.
And if so, like, how much are they, what do they pay for, and when do you need them?
Yep, got it.
And then the second one is for Justin and Amanda. The work that you've presented is based on both Picus's work and Colby's work, Ayer's work. And I've heard you a bunch of times sort of reflect back to their assumptions. And I'm struggling to know whether I should be having them in, like whether Professor Colby should be coming in to explain the weights that you're using, or whether Picus should be coming in to explain the base underlying your base, or whether you want to be accountable for all of those numbers yourself. And how much consulting you've been able to do with both of them, given that you used their work.
So I think that, go ahead. So I think go ahead.
Your turn, Justin.
Your turn, Justin.
Perfect. I think we can absolutely own how we've used that information and turned it into the recommendations we've provided. I think the theory of action and wanting to learn more about the theory of action with the evidence base, that is something I think Larry Picus could absolutely be useful to help with. And we have talked to Larry and given him an understanding of the adjustments we've made, not asking him to say if they're right or wrong, but so that he knows what we've done with the model. Again, with the EL work, I think we're happy to walk through how we took that and use that to estimate our weight. I think we could talk a lot about the underlying theory because, again, much of the work was built off work we've done in Ohio and Nevada. But I think to talk about the specifics of that report, that would be something Dr. Colby would do. And we have not had an opportunity to talk to her.
We do have time scheduled with her.
Okay.
Any other requests for our witnesses for next week? I guess I would echo Representative Brady's request to see kind of a real life modeling of a school to see if it actually does match what their proposed spending is.
That's fair. Yep.
I have one more.
We heard also budget wish list is what I heard.
We heard budget wish list is what we wrote.
Just teasing.
Yes. So we've talked about
support.
We've talked about sort of resources for individual students, and we've talked about the new districts. I'm having trouble imagining comparing if the spending for we've looked at the comparison in statewide spending under this model and under current law.
Sure.
It would be very helpful to understand that on a district by district basis comparison.
Okay.
And then sort of the next step of how is that going to actually change tax rates on a district by district level? And I know that's outside of APA and over to the tax department, but that's all helpful to get into in the next.
And I think that modeling has been done by the tax department. Amanda, would you?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Okay.
Amanda, would you mind briefly speaking to that district to district crosswalk? Because I just want to, if you wouldn't mind speaking to some of the challenges of sort of asking for that one-to-one, because that's sort of.
Well, I think what they're asking for, which is fair, is how is this going to be staged? right? I mean, I think there's kind of an understanding of where we're headed, the vision, how things are prioritized to be funded. I think the questions I'm hearing would be through that 2-year transition, what's the staging? What does that look like in practice, and how will support be provided to the field to make sure, right, that we're still able to educate kids now, right, while we're doing this transition work. That's, I think, what I'm hearing.
And what is the impact on
and what is
households
the
of
impact
that
on
transition?
schools?
Yes.
What is the impact on taxpayers?
Yes, that I think we can definitely provide. It was more of that like existing district to new concept thing that doesn't quite.
Long, Burkhart, Brady.
Just sort of following up on that, we've heard an awful lot today about, in response to questions about potentially additional needs. Whether that's through the transition or in the final product. You mentioned a community schools coordinator might be needed. We talked about additional resources needed at the AOE potentially. We've talked about the variabilities, which keeps hitting me in the back of my head, the variabilities of our state and the schools that may or may not be able to see both the equity that you keep mentioning and probably may not be able to be merged. So those all are additional costs that I don't think are built in, and so, or maybe some of them are, but it seems like some of them just popped up today. So I just want to make sure, and honestly, I really don't need to be, I'm just asking that they are part of this and that we're able to understand what exactly they are.
These are all the right questions, right? I mean, we've done work in modeling, and we need to make sure we're coming back and making that explicit and that we're responding to the questions. So this is the conversation that we need to be having now. So I really appreciate that. When we're talking about the choices, we've baked into the base those resources and the flexibility to make those choices for like community schools. So just want to mention that what we discussed today wasn't outside of what we've built in. These were conversations that we've been having as an administration around how do we make sure that this base and the weights have the flexibility to meet these different needs. So that's one piece. In terms of the capacity for the agency, in the governor's plan, he's also put forward additional resources for the Agency of Education to support with this transition and supporting with capacity building. And we can certainly share what's built into that in terms of what we would expect to do with those dollars in terms of supporting the academics and supporting operations and the formation of the new boards and districts. So we have that, and that has been contemplated as part of this. In terms of variability, we have contemplated that there will be different costs because there is such variability with how things are implemented. We can share with you how we have estimated that. I think what you've heard today is as we get into the weeds, there might be different modeling that's needed, but we have baked in estimates, understanding that there will be schools that will continue to operate at a small scale, right? And those adjustments have been baked in, but I think it's absolutely critical that we bring that forward, right? And there still will be further questions. And I think this is the healthy part of the process to doing this. Getting it right is really important. So I appreciate this.
I wanted to offer, because I know that this is important for conversations that are happening right now. One of the kind of things that a lot of us are talking about is class size minimums. It is not data that we have ever collected at the agency, and so we're actually probably Monday deploying a data collection, and that's going to be, I think, really helpful to you all, but also really helpful to us in understanding where do we have school systems that that are going to be particularly challenged to achieve class size minimums, so that we know where to kind of target those supports, and then also understand how they're reflected in the modeling. So that's information that we're going to try to turn around as quickly as possible. We have things like course enrollment data, but this is another one of those places where we've overturned the rock and said, this data collection is not as consistent as we would like it to be. So we're going to do this kind of baseline data collection also as a way to validate our course enrollment data.
Yes, so just to clarify there, we do have reporting around staffing and class size, but as we've been talking with our partners in the field, they're like, that's not exactly representing how we are organizing our classroom. So this is not starting from scratch. We've taken the data that we have been collecting for many years and we have a process to validate that and to make some adjustments so that we're more precise. So I just want to clarify, we do have data that we have been collecting, but we, as part of what we've been doing as an agency, we have been validating, right? And so sometimes coding has been represented differently by districts, and those are the types of things that we're starting to get clarity on, so to be more precise.
Representative Burkhart?
Yes, I think I know the answer to this question, but nowhere has it been presented that districts would be allowed to raise anything above the payment that they're getting from the state. Is that contemplated, or are we saying that this is what people are getting once we've agreed on a number and no one can raise any more?
Yeah, so those are really important policy considerations that we have been working through with tax. I can say one of the value in having larger regions is you have more equity in terms of property wealth as you start to think about the ability to raise additional dollars. But it's important that in pursuing that policy option that we're really thoughtful around equalization mechanisms and ensuring that there would be opportunity to raise the same amount, while also, talking about how we can really, use this funding in a way that's going to optimize, right? So we're still, again, I think it's important to reinforce with this model, we're still one of the top spenders in education, right? And there's ways that I think that we can use those dollars to be more impactful. But yes, we follow up on that.
All right, Representative Brady, Holcomb, then Odie.
Two things that I hope we can get more information on by next week. You started to talk about it a little bit, so maybe it's in the governance piece, but it feels very finance, which is that intra within a district, how funds are, being distributed to schools. Having been in a district that went through consolidation, there's a lot of stuff to work out there.
Yes.
And certainly probably some assumptions even in the base potentially about that, or at least or about how the weights operate. And the second question is, it just occurred to me based on the cafeteria piece of, not counting kitchen staff and assuming that we're going to have, essentially run restaurants and schools that pay for kitchen staff, which is not how a single school operates right now. I'm trying to get my head around other things we might be missing in these numbers. I don't see anything around coaches, extracurriculars, theater, things that are the heartbeat of a lot of schools that communities love. Are we assuming all extracurriculars and athletics and sports teams are fundraised, are outside of any kind of school budget? And then I'm trying to think about what other.
Can Amanda speak to that? We can clarify that right
I
now.
can speak to that.
That amount, there is an amount for student activities that you'll see. Jill's been very good at telling me which table it is when it's in front of me. But that is considered as part of the base, because we know how important those extracurricular opportunities and enrichments are for students and engagement.
But that's also included in the base.
Yes, that's in the base.
And there were adjustments also within middle school to have more electives as well, so in addition to student activities.
Representative Holcomb, then Representative Odie.
I think you were first, actually.
Page 7.
If we already had a weight for middle school and high school, I wonder whether we just shouldn't wait for middle school and high school instead of incorporating extracurriculars and so forth into the base. That came up after you answered that question, but the thing is that, when you first look at it and you look at per pupil costs, you say, oh, Vermont looks high. But then you realize that other schools don't include in their per pupil costs, maybe mental health care, social services, and so forth. So I wondered if you could separate instructional services from non-instructional services.
I'm sorry.
And so that we see what per pupil cost is. So if we wanted to compare ourselves to another state, we could just pull that out.
Under
And
current law?
That request is for
Sure,
our
under current
current
law is
per
fine.
pupil spending? Is that what you're looking at?
So if I'd like to
I think
maybe
you
we
could
focus
look
on
at
per
that.
pupil spending so we can get an idea of where we are today here in Vermont, where we are compared to maybe pick out any three states and figure it out.
And I do think that's possible with federal data that's available. It's going to be a few years back. There's a little lag, but they do break down spending in every state, in every LEA based on instruction admin. So you can do that kind of look state to state and how much you spend in those areas.
Maybe we could you could put it in the slide or something.
And I think we've done some work too, just with the expenditure analysis and really trying to piece out the different components that are built into the spending. So that might be an area where we can expand as well to get more refined.
So maybe people wouldn't get upset when they see our spending because it's all lumped together rather than separated out.
And I think maybe doing that comparison, Amanda and Justin, with some of the other kind of quote unquote high spenders, I think also would be helpful. We do know, and we'll get some data hopefully to help us articulate this, but nationally, mental health is increasingly an issue that we do see. It's a national trend, and those cost pressures do land on schools as well. Amanda, I think you can clarify in the grade band weights, just very briefly, there was a very specific policy choice that was behind that, and we can just offer that clarification.
Yeah, no, I think that's helpful. So there's two pieces of that. If you're looking at the evidence-based model, if you actually looked at the per student amount that it generates for elementary versus middle versus high school, it actually tends to be more expensive in elementary, largely driven by those lower class sizes that they assume K through 3. So in part, it's different than how you currently think about weighting for secondary. In the evidence-based model, the spending would be higher in elementary school. And then the other piece I wanted to say really starts to lead into that governance conversation of now all the districts would be operational K through 12. So from a practical standpoint, you tend to need weights by grade band when you have different configurations within your district, if you only have an elementary district or only a high school district. So a practical consideration there. And then the evidence-based being a little different in terms of theory of action from what you might have in your current system. So.
All right, last request or question?
And I can
For today.
actually share the F33 data for fiscal year 23, because I think that's the most recently available. And Vermont pretty consistently for the last 20 years has spent about $2,000 more per kid on support services relative to neighbor states in New England. It's actually pretty interesting, which is consistent with heavy provision of social services and anti-poverty work in schools. I have two little questions. One is, when you collect data for all the schools in our portfolio, are you collecting it for all the schools in our portfolio? Because it would be helpful to have that data as well. And then the other one is, when you come back, there are ways in which our current state deviates from PICUS, but there's also ways in which your assumptions deviate from PICUS.
True.
And it might be helpful to sort of lay those out because they have significant cost implications.
Absolutely.
Representative Holcomb, were you saying all schools, including not public schools, but also independent schools
Right.
within the portfolio?
Right.
Yes, I just wanted to make sure that's what you meant.
Yes.
Okay, to be continued. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.